So good evening, everyone. And first of all, thank you everyone who is on. And for those who are joining after, this recording will be uploaded, God willing. And I am super, super excited about tonight's class because we are starting a new book in the Torah, a new series in the Torah of the book of Shemot. And the book of Shemot is a story that has so many dramatic events, so many miracles that happen during this Torah portion, the upcoming Torah portions, and just an incredible array of human emotions, human challenges, and human triumphs that we experience in this Torah portion. Now, we know that the exile in Egypt, the slavery in Egypt, and the subsequent exodus from Egypt is by far one of the most momentous milestones in the history of the Jewish people. And the slavery in Egypt is definitely a focal point in what shaped the existence of the Jewish nation. Because the slavery in Egypt and the experience that the Jewish people had in Egypt following then after the exodus from Egypt and the arrival in the desert is what led up to the receiving of the Torah. And in this book, in the next several Torah portions, which we will be discovering and exploring and really delving deep into, we will be able to see and understand the story of what shaped the Jewish people, and more importantly, the story of the people in this story, the feelings of the people in this story, those who were experiencing the slavery in Egypt and the subsequent exodus. So there's a beautiful story that's told, and I think it's apropos to share it on this Torah class because I personally have had experiences that made me recall this story. There was a Chabad rabbi in Australia who was working very, very hard to make an event for women to teach about Taharat HaMishpacha, to teach about family purity, the laws of Jewish marriage, the laws of mikvah. And he put tremendous effort into planning the event and doing a lot of marketing for the event. He wanted to draw a large crowd to inspire the women to keep the laws of mikvah. And he was very disappointed when only one woman showed up. Now, he put so much effort into it. He really had tried so hard to make this a resounding success. And one woman came. And the lecturer that was brought in to speak at this event on this topic spoke to that one woman. But it was a far cry from the type of event that he was hoping to have. And after the event, he wrote a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he wrote a letter to the Rebbe explaining what happened, reporting on the event, as it is the custom for Chabad followers to write a letter to the Rebbe reporting on events that take place in the community to share their successes and their struggles with the Rebbe. And he wrote that he was so disappointed that only one woman came. And the Rebbe responded with such a powerful message. The Rebbe said, Moshe Rabbeinu had one mother. One woman was the one, just one woman, was the one who gave birth to Moses, the leader who took the Jewish people out of Egypt. Now, I think of that story often. As you know, those of you who are here know that the numbers in our Torah class range from sometimes just one to many, many more. And I think about that a lot because for me, and something that I actively think about is that it's the quality, not the quantity. But in that moment, what the Rebbe was teaching him is that the quality of one individual, of one person, is so valuable because of the impact that one person can have on future generations. So with that in mind, let's think, who was Moshe's mother? Anybody know? Anybody know? In this week's Torah portion, Moses is born. Who was his mother? He had one mother. Does anybody know her name? Unmute yourself if you know. Come on, Hebrew Academy girls, where's your knowledge? Anybody?
Zipporah.
Zipporah was his wife, but I'll give you points for that.
Thank you.
Which mom?
Moshe had one mother.
One mother, the
Gave
blood
birth to him.
mom,
The one who gave birth.
the one who gave
But
birth.
gave birth to him. And her name was Yocheved.
There.
Her name was Yocheved. And Yocheved was a unique woman. And in this Torah portion, we encounter her in several instances. And each instance helps us understand the woman that she was and how we can strive to be like her. So the first time we hear about Yocheved is actually in the Torah portion where the Jewish people, in the beginning of this week's Torah portion, the Torah tells us that when the Jews came down to Egypt, Yaakov came down with his family. They were a group of 70 people. Now, if you count the amount of people who left Israel to come to Egypt, there were 69. Who was the 70th? Levi had a daughter. Levi was one of the 12 sons of Yaakov. He had a daughter, Yocheved. She was born as they were entering Egypt, right at the gate of Egypt. That's when his wife gave birth and Yocheved was born. So she was part of the generation that came down to Egypt, but her entire life, she lived in Egypt. Could you just distract her somewhere outside of this area, please? Thank you. She grew up in Egypt. Hannah, Tati has something very special to show you outside. Okay? Something very special to show you. Yeah, take you outside. Back to scheduled programming. So Yocheved was born, in essence, in Egypt. And the beginning of her life, the first 17 years of her life, was when life was amazing for the Jews in Egypt. This was when Yaakov was alive, Joseph was the viceroy. Things were great for the Jews in Egypt. And she saw the shift in Pharaoh's attitude and his behavior towards the Jews. And she witnessed the beginning of the slavery and the shift that happened where the Jews went from being successful shepherds multiplying in Egypt to becoming slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt. And as she grew up, she as an adult was witnessing the tragic difficulty that her fellow Jews were experiencing. And this was very troubling for her. This was very difficult for her to witness. Now, because she was in the tribe of Levi, she was not a slave. The Jews in the tribe of Levi did not work as slaves in Egypt, but they were living in this environment where the Jews were slaves. It was difficult for them as well. And Yocheved gets married. She has 2 children, a daughter, Miriam, and a son, Aaron. And when her daughter was 5 years old, she and her daughter are summoned to the king's palace. Now, the Torah describes them by different names. Yocheved was her name. Her daughter's name was Miriam. And the Torah describes them by different names as Shifra and Pua. And the Torah tells us that they were given these names because of their occupation. What did they do? Yocheved was a midwife, and it was her responsibility and her mission to help women give birth. Now, imagine the fact that she was the midwife for women who were slaves. So her job, helping the women give birth, was more than just as, a practical job where she would help deliver the babies. She was more than that. She was the physical support for the women who were having children, but she was also an emotional support for them. These were women who were giving birth while enduring terrible difficulty. The fact that they were even having children was a huge, huge sacrifice that they were making, because they had to leave their children and go back to work. It was very challenging for them. And Yocheved made it her mission to support the women and encourage them and to remind them what a beautiful thing they were doing, strengthening the survival of the Jewish people by making the Jewish people multiply. And not only that, when the children were born, she would make them calm and beautiful, and she would make sure that they were healthy, and she would help the mothers nourish their children. So her mission was all about supporting mothers and their children. And her daughter, at all of 5 years old, wise and mature beyond her years, was her assistant. And the two of them are summoned to Paro's palace. And Paro issues a command. And the Torah tells us in this week's Torah portion that Paro tells them, every single baby that is born, when you are helping the women give birth, as the woman is delivering her child, every male child, make him die. Now, the Torah doesn't say kill him. The Torah uses the words make him die. Why? What did he actually want? What he wanted was that as the child is being born, the midwives should, and it's horrifying to even imagine, he wanted that the midwives should choke the babies and then tell the mothers that the babies were born stillborn, which was a horrible, tragically devastating idea. And this command was being issued as a decree from the king. Now we're talking about the king Paro who had enslaved an entire nation. He doesn't mess around. He kills people like this. Imagine the horror that Yocheved and Miriam are now facing. They are being forced to do the exact opposite of their entire mission in life. What was her goal in life? To support women. The women trusted her to help them in their most vulnerable moments. And now, what should they do? They should betray that trust, kill the babies, and then tell the mothers that the babies have been born dead. That was beyond understanding. What is the reaction that the Torah tells us? The Torah tells us that the midwives feared God and they did not listen to Paro, and they kept the babies alive. Not only that, not only did they keep the babies alive, but they actually helped the babies survive, and she made sure that the babies were healthy, and she helped them stay healthy, etc., etc. Why did she not listen? What gave her the strength to not listen to Paro? It wasn't her own moral compass. It wasn't her loyalty to the mothers. It wasn't her own sense of right or wrong. It was the fact, Vatir'ena hamiyaldot et ha'elokim. The midwives feared God. The secret to Yocheved's ability to do the right thing in a time where she could have rationalized, God forbid, doing something so terrible as her own life is at stake. And if Paro finds out that she's not doing it, he's going to just get somebody else to do it. But she feared God. Her mind, her decisions were made based on what God says, not what she believes is right, not what people tell her to do, by is this what God wants me to do? And if this is not what God wants me to do, then I don't fear anybody else. It's incredible to think that she did this without even being scared of consequences. Her fear of God, her yirat shamayim, her fear of heaven, was so strong and so focused that she didn't have space in her life to be scared of Paro. So Yocheved's experience gives us this incredible insight into how one can handle difficulty when it's scary to do the right thing. What do we do when we're scared? We channel that fear into fear of God. And fear of God is not a negative feeling. We don't fear God because we're scared that God will punish us. Judaism does not have a mindset of we don't sin because lightning will strike or God will send a plague or something like that. That's not the Jewish mindset towards fear and punishment. The idea of true fear of God is the fear of breaking or weakening the incredible bond that we have with God. Our bond with God is like a rope. It's a rope. And like any rope, it's made up of many tiny threads. If you look at a rope, what is a rope actually? It's a bunch of threads that are bound together to form one thick rope. Our relationship with God is like that. Every mitzvah, every good deed that we do, every spiritual experience that we have adds more threads to our rope, which connects us to God. And an experience where we, God forbid, sin or do something wrong or make a mistake, it loosens one thread in that rope. Our relationship with God is still there because we have a soul, and that soul makes up the core of the rope. But all our spiritual experiences add threads that make the rope stronger. The thicker the rope is, the harder it is to cut. If I have a few threads stuck together and I take my knife, I can just, flip it and it'll snap in a moment. But a very thick rope, even a strong knife like this one, I would have to really, saw through it in order to get through such a thick rope. And yes, I'm at my kitchen counter, so I have sharp knives handy. So the idea of our connection with God is like the thick rope. And our fear of God should not be a negative, I'm scared of what God will do to me if I do the wrong thing. That's not a Jewish approach. The idea of the soul spiritual approach to our relationship with God, which should include a certain element of fear, is I'm scared of weakening my relationship with God because my relationship with God is so valuable to me. So we want to strengthen our relationship with God and make that rope thicker and stronger and more unbreakable. And we fear the unfortunate circumstance of having our relationship with God weakened. But we know that even if our relationship with God weakens, we can always repair the threads. In fact, when we repair the threads, by retying them, they become even stronger, which is the power of teshuvah, the power of returning to God. But Yocheved's mindset, she feared God, meaning that her relationship with God and her clear knowledge of what God wants of her was so much stronger than any rational fear of what Paro might do to her for disobeying. In fact, Miriam, her daughter, who was all of 5 years old, she was not so tactful. She was 5. She had chutzpah. And she went at it. She told Paro straight up what she thought. Are you crazy? What kind of terrible king are you? Oh, we're never going to kill the babies. I'm paraphrasing, by the way, but I could imagine a 5-year-old's chutzpah. So Paro wanted to actually put her to death for her complete insolence. And Yocheved actually had to convince Paro not to kill her own daughter by saying, she's just a kid. It would be beneath you to become insulted by the words of a child. And that's how Miriam survived. And then when Paro called them back to the palace and said, why didn't you listen? Why didn't you kill the babies? She made up an excuse. And she said, well, actually, the Jewish women, they give birth so quickly that by the time we got there, they've already given birth. So they know their children are alive. We couldn't do it because they give birth so quickly and easily and painlessly that we don't even have a chance to get there. They give birth like animals in the wild. We don't even have a chance to get there, which was completely untrue. They did give birth easily, but the midwives were definitely there for them. But because their fear and their focus was on their relationship with God, they had no place to worry about their relationship with Paro. So we see that Yocheved's faith in Hashem was so strong, which sets the stage for the next experience that Yocheved endures. After the decree that Paro tried to initiate with the midwives, which he saw was unsuccessful, he comes up with a second plan. And that plan was that every baby boy that is born would be thrown into the Nile. And the reason he did this was because his astrologers saw in the stars that a baby boy would be born. And this baby boy would eventually take the Jews out of Egypt. And he panicked. I can't have the Jews leaving Egypt. I want my slaves in Egypt. Now, the astrologers told him that this leader of the Jews, his life would end with an event connecting with water, which, by the way, was true at the end of Moses' life, after he took the Jews out of Egypt and after they were in the desert. The end of his life was connected with an event connected with water, which was the event that happened when God told him to speak to the rock to bring out water when the Jews didn't have water in the desert, and he hit the rock and water came out, and that was the circumstances surrounding his death. So what the astrologers had seen was actually correct, but Paro interpreted it differently, and he said, well, if the leader is supposed to have his life end with water, let me preempt everything by throwing all the baby boys into the water, and then this future leader will be killed in the water. And when that happened, and that decree was announced, Yocheved and her husband Amram were faced with a terrible decision. How could we bring more children into the world if there's a 50-50 chance that our children will die? Is that a responsible thing to do? There's a 50-50 chance we'll have a boy, and that boy will be killed. How can we do this? And they decided to divorce. And Yocheved and her husband were role models for all the Jewish people in their area. Her husband Amram was a leader in the tribe of Levi. And when they separated, many, many other Jewish families followed their example, and couples were divorcing, which was quite tragic because that would mean the end of Jewish continuity. And Miriam, the same chutzpaniak, the same 5-year-old girl who speaks her mind, she had a prophecy. Now, let's be very clear that her ability to speak her mind was coming from a place of wisdom and prophecy. And she saw a prophetic vision that her parents would be the ones to have the child who would become the leader of the Jewish people. And she realized that if her parents don't have any more children, then this leader will not be born. And so she went to her parents and she said, you know what? You are even worse than Paro. Your decision is even worse than Paro's decision, because Paro's decree means there will be no more boys. But your choice means there won't be boys or girls. And her parents said, you know what? She's right. And they remarried. And when they remarried, all of the Jews who had separated did as well. And many more Jewish children were born as a result of that prophecy. And Yocheved becomes pregnant. Now imagine what she's going through. She knows better than anybody else, because she had had a personal interaction with Paro. She knows that if she has a boy, he won't survive, because Paro is going to kill him. And to her great joy and delight, she has a baby boy 3 months early. Now, nobody knows that she's already given birth. She did not leave her home while she was pregnant. And the Egyptians weren't expecting her to give birth for another 3 months. So they didn't come looking for her baby to take him away. So she hid him in the house. And Rashi tells us that the house was aglow with the light of spirituality, with the light of holiness and godliness, because this baby was Moses. This baby was Moshe. He did not have a name yet, though, not the name Moshe. And 3 months pass, and now she knows this is his due date. The Egyptians know that this is when she's supposed to give birth, and they will come knocking. And she says, you know what? We're going to try to trick the stars. The astrologers are going to be looking in the stars like they did every day to see if the baby boy who is the intended leader of the Jews is in the water yet. So she takes a wicker box. She puts her baby inside, and she puts him in the Nile. And Miriam, her daughter, is standing from far, supervising to make sure that everything will be okay. Could you please take the headphone? So that's what happens. Baby is now in the water. And Yocheved has, in essence, just abandoned her child. There is no guarantee that she will ever see her child again. And the only thing she can do is trust in God. That's all she has. She has her faith. And the daughter of Paro, the princess, comes down to the water at that exact moment. She sees the box. She takes the box. She sees the child, and she knows that this child is a Jewish child. Jewish child. This is Paro's daughter. Don't you think she would just, dump him overboard? So what happens? And we're back. I apologize. So the daughter of Paro sees her, takes him, and this baby was infused with so much holiness, so much intelligence, that he refuses to nurse from any of the Egyptian wet nurses. Could you imagine that? He's 3 months old. He understands the difference between kosher milk and non-kosher milk. And the daughter of Paro is stuck. The baby's crying. He's hungry. He's refusing to nurse from any of the royal wet nurses that she provides. And Miriam, who's standing right there, comes up with a brilliant plan. She walks over to the princess and says, can I help you? I see that you're stuck. Would you like me to bring a Jewish wet nurse to come nurse this child? And the daughter of Paro says, yes, go. So who does she go to? She calls her mother, come nurse my baby, our baby. Our baby is now with the princess. Come feed him. And that's what happens. And the daughter of Paro actually hires Yocheved to be the wet nurse for this baby that she is now adopting. And Yocheved is now given a job. She is now being paid to breastfeed her own child. And she takes him home. And what emotional turmoil that must have been for her. First of all, the joy that her child is alive. But also, she only has a very short time with her child, and then she has to give him to the daughter of Paro to be raised in Paro's palace. What thoughts and emotions must she have been going through during this time? Now, I want to ask you, unmute yourself. What would you do in that situation? If you were Yocheved, what would you do during that time?
Fight for your child.
Fight for your child? Okay. Anybody else?
I think I would have tried to like escape somehow with
Okay.
him.
Escape with him somehow? Anybody else? Imagine what must have been going through her mind. Now, you know what she did? And let's remember that the faith that she lived with was the only way she was able to do this.
She prayed.
She knew, I'm sure she did. She knew that her time with her child was limited. So she used every single moment of that time to educate her child with faith, so that when he would be returned to the palace, he would have the basis of a Torah education to sustain him spiritually until he would reach adulthood and he would be able to come back and see her. Imagine the fortitude it took to put her own feelings aside and say, what can I give to this child during the precious time that God has given him back to me, to be able to give him everything he needs to be a God-fearing, faithful Jew, to be connected to Hashem for the rest of his life. During those 2 years that she raised him and nourished him, she didn't just feed him physically, she fed him spiritually. She educated him. And the entire basis of Moses' life, imagine Moshe Rabbeinu, the leader of the Jewish people, who was the only person who was able to converse with God like talking to a human being, the only person who saw such clear prophecy, the only person who took the Jewish people out of Egypt. Moshe's relationship with God was unique to any other righteous person. Moshe was considered half human, half godly. The basis of that was the 2 years that he was educated by his mother. That's what gave him the basis of everything he needed for the rest of his life. Imagine that. How is she able to do that? How is she able to put aside her own emotions and focus on what was needed?
Fear.
What was it?
Fear.
Fear? Yes, it was fear. It was her fear of God. That same strong relationship with God that she had when she did not listen to Paro enabled her to do the same thing then. And that gives us an insight, number one, into the power of faith. And number two, the incredible ability that we have to transmit our values to other people. I was having a discussion this morning with a group of girls in seminary that I teach. And I asked them to write down 3 values that they want their children to have. And all the girls said different things. And then I asked them, I said, what do you need to do in order for your children to absorb those values later on, God willing, when they have children? And a lot of them had to really think about it. What do you have to do now before you have children? And these are girls who are post high school. What do you have to do before you have children in order to have the ability to transmit those values? And the girl said different things. You have to talk about it. You have to figure out how you're going to teach it. And the discussion that we had was, in order to truly transmit values to other people, whether it's children or family members or people in your surroundings, or even to solidify it for yourself, you have to live them. You know, one of the girls said she wants her children to value themselves, which is a really important value that we should want for our children and those around us, that her children should respect themselves and realize their intrinsic value. And I told her, I said, well, do you value yourself? And we got into a discussion about the fact that if a mother values herself, her children will be able to value themselves. But if a mother just tells her children how valuable they are, but never demonstrates the fact that she respects herself, the children will never pick that up. Because what we teach other people is not what we tell them. It's what we live by that they see. Now, of course, this isn't a guaranteed formula that always happens, but the first step of being able to solidify a value in other people is to live with it for ourselves. The way Yocheved was able to give her child the faith that he needed to withstand all of the trials and tribulations that would take place in his life while living in Egypt, later on when he has to escape from Egypt because he killed an Egyptian and Paro found out about it and he had to run away because Paro wanted to kill him. He spent 40 years as a king in a different country. He then came to Midian and he married Tzipporah, who was the daughter of Yitro, the priest in Midian. He then had children. He then had the experience at the burning bush where he conversed with God, where God made him the leader. He then went to Paro and told him to let the Jews go. And we know that Paro did not like that idea very much. Going on to the whole story of the plagues and then being able to take the Jews out of Egypt, there was a lot of trial and a lot of tribulations that took place in Moshe's life. Many, many challenges that he had to overcome. And his faith was unwavering. Where did he learn this? He learned that from his mother. Yocheved's unshakable faith was the example that Moshe looked towards and saw and experienced and understood fully and absorbed for himself. Interestingly, that was when he was a very young child, which is why Jewish education starts from a very young age. In life as Jews, we focus a lot on educating children from when they're very young, even when it's hard for them to understand and really grasp what's happening, which for me personally is something that I'm experiencing right now, because as many of you know, in the Jewish halacha, in Jewish law, women observe the laws of modesty. And everyone practices on their own level, but the law and the custom in Judaism is that women dress modestly. The law dictates that we cover our elbows and our knees. We wear dresses or skirts. Our shirts are up to our collarbones. And in our custom, specifically in Hasidic custom, we start that at the age of 3. At the age of 3, girls begin wearing completely modest clothing. And the truth of the matter is that does a 3-year-old really know the difference between the clothing? Does a 3-year-old really understand modesty? Is a 3-year-old really experiencing, any form of immodesty? Is that a thing for a 3-year-old? No. And yet, my Chana, who you saw just before and heard quite a bit, had just had her 3rd birthday yesterday. And she has been wearing, we started a little early because, by the way, if you think 3-year-olds don't have opinions about clothing, oh, they do, very much so. And we've been practicing, and she now wears fully modest clothing. Why? Because education starts from such a young age. And when we educate our children from such a young age, it becomes part of them on such an intrinsically deep level. And it becomes absorbed on a much more profound level with such a deeply meaningful experience. And I'm sure that each one of us can think back to some core value that we have from our childhood, that if it's a good value, then it's part of us and it will never leave us. And if, God forbid, it's a negative value, we know that it's so hard to shake if it was ingrained in us from when we were children. And the basis of Jewish education begins from such a young age. The beauty is that children can really be at any and every age. If we look at our education from the perspective of a child, which means open to absorb new things, open to new experiences, happy to experience things that were never experienced before, then we can have that experience of the education of a young child at any age, as long as we are open to it without all the preconceived notions. Like a child looks at the world and what they see is what it is. They absorb information, they experience circumstances, and that becomes their education. We can learn from that as well and say, when we experience something new, something interesting, something that we haven't learned before, why take all our preconceived notions that we have because we've lived life already and we've experienced so many different things, and we can say, well, I'm not sure about that. Well, I'm not sure I want to incorporate this into our lives. And sometimes we can look at new things with the mind of a child and just keep an open mind and an open, fresh perspective. And then we can have that education like a child, which has such innocence and such beauty, and also becomes absorbed so deeply like a child. So what Yocheved is actually teaching us in her experience with educating her child at such a young age is that we can be like that child as well. And we can experience the world and form deep, intrinsically powerful beliefs if we hold the perspective of a child. So the Torah portion through the eyes of Yocheved shows us such important and powerful messages. Number one, if our focus is on our relationship with Hashem, and our only fear is that, God forbid, that relationship can be weakened, then we don't have room to fear other things, and we can truly be fearless. That's powerful lesson number one. Number two is that when we have an opportunity to do something that has lasting impact, but also is so difficult, it's really difficult to do both. You can't focus on your emotional challenge and on the impact that we could possibly have. We need to try to balance it as best as we can, but we need to remember that if our focus is in our relationship with God, then we can focus on what we can accomplish and how we can use the challenge to create positive change, which is what Yocheved did. She used those 2 years, which could have been the most difficult years of having to raise a child that she knows she will have to give up. But instead, she used that time to teach him, to educate him, and to really empower him for the rest of his life. And the third thing is from the perspective of the child, that in order for us to learn new things and make them intrinsically part of us, we need to approach it from the perspective of a child, with the outlook of fresh, unencumbered by past preconceived notions, and truly accept faith and values and ideas from a place of openness and growth-oriented mindset. So on that note, I will leave all of us with a bang into the beginning of the next book of the Torah. Next week starts the Exodus from Egypt. And God willing, by the time we have our Torah class next week, we should already have experienced, first of all, our own personal exodus from whatever challenge is holding us back. And of course, globally, the exodus from our global exile with the coming of Mashiach. So ladies, if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. And if you have anything to share, I would love to hear from you all. So please unmute yourself.